Chapter 6, Part 2, Video 2, we left off talking about these classifications. Now, for torts, most torts are going to have certain defenses under the law. Of course, you always have, and sometimes referred to as a defense, is the plaintiff didn't prove their case. Okay? I think technically that's not really a defense, it's just the failure of the plaintiff to prove their case, and therefore the defendant wins. But a successful defense releases the defendant from partial or complete liability. And the defense that's available is going to depend on the particular tort and, of course, the facts of the case. Okay, so now we begin talking about intentional torts, which is one of the classifications. And in this situation, the tortfeasor, that is the person who commits the wrongful act, must intend to commit the act. And what that means is that he or she intended the consequences of the act or knew the substantial likelihood of what the consequences would be with regard to the way in which they act. And the law generally assumes that people know what the likely consequences of their act will be. Now, one of the things that we have in intentional torts is what's called transferred intent. And transferred intent is where the tortfeasor intends to harm person A, but unintentionally harms person B and does not harm person A in most situations. So an example of that would be if I went to punch John in the nose and John ducked, and instead I hit Bob, I would still be guilty of the intentional tort of battery against Bob, even though my intent was not against Bob. The intent is transferred, so to speak. Okay, so some of the different types of intentional torts, and there's many of them. We'll talk about the most common ones. Assault and battery, two different torts that often occur in the same situation. So an assault is the threat of immediate harm or offensive conduct, and that conduct arouses apprehension of imminent harm in the possible victim. It does not require any physical contact. If there's physical contact, it's also going to be a battery probably, but the plaintiff has to be aware of the fact. So if I draw my fist and pull it up to about 3 inches of John's nose, that would be an assault. It's a threat of an immediate offensive conduct or harm, creating apprehension of imminent harm, etc. Now the interesting thing about assault is it doesn't have to be something that, and this is true of battery as well, it doesn't necessarily have to be something that would be hurtful physically to the person. It can be any kind of offensive conduct. So instead of putting my fist up against John's face, if I put my hand up about 2 inches from a woman's breast, even though if I touched her, it might not hurt her, it would be offensive conduct, and so that would be an assault. Okay, a battery is the unauthorized or harmful or offensive physical contact with another person. Physical injury is not required. It's just a touching that's required. And it doesn't have to be a harmful touching. It only has to be offensive to a reasonable person. Okay, it can be direct or indirect. In other words, you can actually touch the person, or you can use another object to touch them, a baseball bat or throwing a rock. And transferred intent applies. The interesting thing about battery as opposed to assault is that battery does not require that the victim know that you're committing the battery. Okay? So let me give you an example. With assault, if I go up behind somebody's back, okay, and I go like I'm going to hit them on the top of their head, but I don't do so, and they don't see me, it's not an assault. They have to see it to be put in the position of being aroused about the apprehension of imminent harm. In a battery, if I go up behind the person and I hit them over the head and they didn't know that I did so because they were so drunk that they didn't feel anything, doesn't matter. It's still a battery. Another example of a battery is where a surgeon is performing surgery on a person and goes beyond the scope of the permission of the surgery. So let's suppose, maybe not a surgeon, let's suppose an obstetrician is delivering a baby, and after delivering the baby, he decides that this woman has had enough children, she's got 7, so he's going to tie her tubes. He has not been given permission to do that, but he does so anyway. That's a battery. She didn't have to know about it or be aware of it. Once she learns of it, it's a civil action for battery. Okay. False imprisonment. False imprisonment is the intentional confinement of another person or restraint of another person's activities without justification. You don't have to hold a person for it to be false imprisonment. You can use a physical object like a gate or any kind of barrier or restraint or threat of physical force. Okay. Now, one of the big things that comes into play with businesses is the exception to the responsibility for false imprisonment for what we call shopkeepers or people who run particularly retail establishments. And virtually every state has this. And it's a defense. And it says that a shopkeeper can hold a person against their will if they have reason to believe that the person has committed shoplifting, as long as they have reasonable cause to believe that the person did that, and as long as they hold them for a reasonable time, and it's based upon a reasonable investigation. So there are a lot of lawsuits, and I've handled one of these. There are a lot of lawsuits that are based upon shopkeepers detaining people for under the shopkeeper's privilege. Owners of shops or businesses have to be very careful and have to train their employees well. If you look at the cases, you're going to see a lot of cases in this area. Let me give you one example. It was a Walmart case. Walmart probably gets sued more than most because of its size, I guess. But there was a lady who bought a child seat in Walmart. She took it home, used it for a few weeks, was back at Walmart shopping and had her child in this seat, this child seat. She had never taken off the label that came with the seat from the manufacturer. Somebody in the store saw that, and as she was trying to leave the store, they assumed that she was shoplifting. So they held her against her will for a period of time, and she sued, and the courts found that that was not reasonable, and the reason they did that was facts of the case. If they had inspected the child care seat, they would have seen a lot of stains and crumbs and things that would not have been possible for a short period of time in the store, and they would have realized that, as she said, that she had purchased it earlier and just neglected to take the label off. So it's very fact intensive when we're talking about shopkeeper's privilege, and it's an area where business owners are very vulnerable and need to be very careful. Okay, so we're going to stop there with part 2 of chapter 6, and we'll pick up with part 3. Remember, the magic word is duty.